Greetings. This lecture is Decisions Under Uncertainty, specifically how do we manage the unexpected. We've talked about how decisions we can make are very programmed, they're very rational decisions because they're very simple and basic, and we already know all the options, we know all the information, so we're just choosing A or B. But the challenge comes as we have less and less information available to us. Sometimes we have all the information in terms of the objectives, but we're still not clear what's going to happen. We know A could happen, we know B could happen, so when we choose something, we're still not 100% sure what will that be. Then we're making decisions under uncertainty, and then really under adversity or under ambiguity. In those circumstances, we have very little information, and many times we don't even know what's going on and why it's happening, but yet we're still faced with having to make decisions with very little information. And this is where the analyzer struggles, clearly, as we've had these discussions. When you're in a crisis mode, you have to be able to assess a situation fairly quickly, tap into your brain reserves and your intuition, and move forward in terms of being able to make a decision. So this lecture is going to address how we can be more present when we have to make decisions under uncertainty or in situations where things are very ambiguous. We're going to talk about mindfulness and how mindfulness can inform the way that we can make decisions when there's a lot of chaos swirling around us and we have very little information to work off of. This naturally feeds into the next lecture, which is going to be on managing a crisis, because a lot of times when we're managing a crisis, it is under situations of uncertainty or situations of ambiguity where we have very little information, and yet we still need to act in a way that's in the best interest of our company and our employees. Another thing that we're going to address besides mindfulness is improvisation, and the improvisation material is really going to be covered in the lecture on mindfulness as a part of that. Improvisation, while we know it from Saturday Night Live and Whose Line Is It Anyway, and those sort of comedy shows, we know improv is also used in an applied way within organizations to help them make better decisions, to help them work better with their employees, to be more creative, to be more collaborative. It's an incredible and powerful tool used by all sorts of business organizations all across the country. Unfortunately, because this is a fully online class, I can't have you go through the improv like I normally do with my hybrid or face-to-face classes. And I may try to change that in the future. But for now, I'm going to show you improv, show you how implied improv can work, and then hopefully you'll be thinking about the concept of yes and, as you'll see in a little bit, how that helps us to make better decisions. We've talked about the continuum of making decisions from the rational model to the decision-making under ambiguity, that continuum in previous lectures. So here we're starting to get at, given this information, given how much information we may have, what tools should we use to best help us make decisions, particularly as information becomes less and less certain to us. So let's start with the most certain situation, and that's the upper left-hand corner in box 1, where we have certainty in our problem consensus and we have certainty in solution knowledge. So under those circumstances, we will be using the rational approach. It's pretty straightforward, makes perfect sense. We know what the options are, we know what the solutions are, and it's just about choosing what's the best thing to do in this moment. So there's an enormous amount of agreement on what's the right thing to do. When we have certainty in the consensus of what's going on, but we're unclear about the best solution, then we tend to use judgment and trial and error. And so that means we give it a shot, we see what happens, we take a couple steps forward, that doesn't work, we move backwards, we try something else, we move backwards, we move forward, move backwards. So in the Apollo 13 example, they're clear what the problem is. No one doubts what the problem is. The challenge, though, is what's the best way to deal with the problem. No one's clear. So it's a trial and error situation. That's why they put them in a team, they put them in a room and said, okay, here's what we got. We've got to solve this problem. How do we do it? It wasn't a rational approach. They had to, really think outside of the box and be as creative as possible. So that's where that trial and error comes into play. If we move over to the upper right-hand quadrant now, where we are uncertain in terms of the consensus about what is going on and what the actual problem is, but we understand with the host of solutions we have, we understand the certainty of the solutions. We just aren't clear on sort of what's the right path to take to get there. And that's when you have to use bargaining and coalitions and negotiation. And in that situation, you believe this is the solution to the problem. I believe something else is a solution to the problem. We're at odds. And we have to figure out how do we get ourselves to a place where we can actually agree on what's the right approach to things. So that's where we use bargaining, coalition, negotiation, things like that at the individual level. When we are uncertain in terms of agreement on the problem and we really don't know what's going to happen, that's really at the highest level of ambiguity, where we really are unclear about things. That's when we use bargaining and judgment, and we try to imitate, inspire. You know, we're on total garbage can model here, boss. Basically, it means we're flying by the seat of our pants. And sometimes we have to use our intuition. Sometimes we have to use this judgment from past experiences, but recognize that these situations aren't identical. So we go from the upper left-hand quadrant, where everything is very confident, very clean, very easy, it's very rational, to the bottom right-hand quadrant, where we really aren't clear about it much of anything, and then sort of that in-between stage there with boxes 2 and 3. What I was speaking of to you is how the individual makes those decisions, but there's also this issue of at the organization level. You know, what organization level tools would an organization use to be able to make decisions under those circumstances? And sort of the corollary to the rational approach with individual decision making would be the management science approach. We plug everything into a linear model. The linear model projects what we should do. We make a decision based on the linear model. Everything works perfectly. Under the bargaining, coalition, negotiation format, we use the Carnegie Model, which is where we have to build our coalitions and we make agreements back and forth, et cetera, et cetera. In terms of the organization level issues, when we typically would use judgment or trial and error, we use the incremental decision process, where we try to break things down into smaller units and we move forward, we move backwards, we just try to figure out what's the best approach. And then lastly, when you have a whole lot of ambiguity, everything helps. Every tool in the toolbox helps. Carnegie Model, incremental decision processes. Eventually it becomes sort of like a giant garbage can. We plug something out, see if it works. If it doesn't, we keep trying. And that's how we sort of learn how to do this. And the next couple slides basically are just these rough descriptions of how these organization level decision models map to that continuum of making decisions from, you know, completely rational and known to the unknown and the ambiguous. So here we are with management science, which is quadrant 1. It's basically statistical mathematical models, things that you already learned in some of your stats classes, or if you took MBA 521, you learned basic management science in MBA 521. The Carnegie Model, as we talked about previously, basically argues that because we have bounded rationality, we have limited access to information, we have to satisfice. And so what we're talking about with the Carnegie Model is sort of satisficing at the group and organization level. How do we build coalitions? How do we build consensus or compromise, whatever it takes, at the organization level? So the Carnegie Model looks at, how do we agree? How do we get somebody on our side? How do we get them to buy into the ideas that we have so we can move the entire organization forward? It requires some political skills, no doubt about that. It's negotiation skills, absolutely. Again, all skills that are really important in your skill building. And again, you know, the next slide here, Carnegie Model talks about probabilistic search. You know, that we do that limited search bias, right, where we just do a limited search because of the satisficing need and the push to do that. So we should be really careful when we're engaged in this probabilistic search to ensure that we're not just, you know, looking at what's convenient as opposed to trying the best that we can to get as much information as possible. And it really also depends on time constraints and things like that. But when we can take a little bit of time to do some research, it's important that we don't limit our our search for a solution or search for information, we don't limit the scope of what we're looking at. Because if we do that, then we're not bringing mindfulness to our decision process, which you'll see in a little bit is really important. The incremental decision process, as I talked about, is how we break down our decision process or our, the issue that we're trying to solve into smaller chunks, smaller, more easily identifiable problems and solutions. You can't take a big problem and solve it in one big, huge, decision. You've got to try and try again. It's a little bit of trial and error. We try something, it works, great, we move forward. If that doesn't work, we move back down the decision tree, we try the other path, we try something else. And the goal here is that we have to identify what the issue is, we develop a problem, we select a solution, and then we try it. And if it works, great, we continue moving forward. So what it's arguing is we have to just look at small wins, small victories, in those small chunks in the way that we're managing the project. That's the only way that makes a project doable, of course. So the garbage can model, love the way it's defined. It's basically organized anarchy, cracks me up. The idea of the garbage can model is when we have so much uncertainty and we're not clear what to do, it's a trial and error. We do all sorts of different things, and we have to recognize that, as players change, the decision models and the decision trees that we use and the coalitions that we built are going to change over time. So it really combines the stuff that we do with intuition and the Carnegie Model and coalition building, and satisficing and the trial and error process. I mean, it's about, it all kind of gets lumped together, and we have to be willing to be very open to different ideas, be really careful about your probabilistic searches. We don't want to be just focused on a narrow band of solutions, because satisficing does narrow our vision as opposed to broadening it. So we want to be really careful about that. Typically, when the garbage can model makes sense is when there's a lot of disagreement on what's going on and what's the best solution, when people are unclear what's happening and why, and when there's a lot of different people that are kind of coming and going. And so a garbage can model tends to happen because there's an enormous amount of turnover and an enormous amount of chaos, basically, for lack of a better word, that's going on in the company at that time. So programmed versus non-programmed decision. We've talked about this a little bit. A programmed decision is one where we're pretty clear what it is. It's very routine. We know the choices are A or B. It's a lower level decision. There's a very clear standard operating procedure, how to handle these sorts of things. It's kind of mechanistic decision making, if you will. If we think back to mechanistic decision mechanistic decisions that are made within a mechanistic design in a company, as we were talking about under the organizational design lecture. So programmed decisions, like rational decisions, when everything is pretty much known to you, the SOP makes it very easy. So you know the next step, and then the next step, and then the next step on things. Nowadays, we use computer simulations and data processing decision trees and things like that to help us. But basically, your SOPs, your manuals, step 1, do this, step 2, do this. That's really easy. And so we tend to allow our lower level employees to do those kinds of decisions, because they are best served making those kinds of decisions, the programmed decisions. It's the non-programmed ones that are much more complex, that don't have any predictability about what's the right solution, because we are missing enormous amounts of information, or we've never had an experience with this sort of thing before. It tends to be novel. It may not be a one-time event. It could be an event that may be now the new normal. We have to switch the way that we think about things, but it is a shock or a surprise to us, and we have to figure out what's the best way to handle it. In the past, we used rules of thumb and intuition, and now we have more tools. We can help people with heuristic problem-solving techniques. We're teaching them how to think outside of the box, as we've been talking about. And that's obviously a lot of the things that I'm trying to work with you guys on, is teaching you how to be better at making heuristic problem-solving techniques, applying those techniques to non-programmed decisions, to crises and things like that.